So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our climate integration into urban forestry and stormwater plan. I'm Desi from Clean Air Partnership, and with me, our guest speakers today are a team of students from University of Toronto, Alisa, Casper, Kiana, Megan, Kadi, Chelsea, Grace, and Malika, who helped us pull up this research together in current practices and where we should go with the climate integration. As you may know, this is a continuation of our effort to support our municipal members in integrating climate change. A few years ago, we did the climate integration into official plans, and we realized that this needs to happen in every plan. So in this research, we focus on the urban forestry and stormwater plans, but this is going to be a part of a bigger primer on consideration and questions and conversations that need to be happening when climate integration is happening in municipal plans. So after their presentation, we are going to turn it to you because we want to hear what is the current state of integration in your jurisdiction, specifically in these plans, in the stormwater plans and urban forestry plans, but also generally had other climate integration and other plans had occurred. We're going to share, feel free to, we're going to share a Menti link in the chat, but feel free to do it in the chat box as well to provide your update. After that, we're going to hear from Jade from Ontario Urban Forest Council. She's going to speak about the recent research that they did in kind of like a scan, and that should wrap it up. I wanted to start with land acknowledgement. Clean Air Partnership is a Toronto-based organization, and we acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. A quick plug-in. I wanted to share with you a course that we developed with the purpose of informing elected officials or staff that does not normally work with climate on climate actions at the local level. Feel free to take it yourself. There is a certification at the end, or to recommend it to someone else. And I will share a link to the course in the chat shortly. Lastly, our upcoming events on April 3rd, we are going to talk about district energy ownership models. And on April 17th, we are going to do an overview of provincial reports on climate change impacts and adaptation. The best way to stay tuned with our upcoming events is by subscribing to our newsletter. I'll share a link in the chat, or if you access our website under the events page. Very quickly, just a reminder, and I'm going to share again in the chat, but after the presentation, we'll be asking you, has your municipality incorporated climate change? How does incorporation happen in other plans? And generally, what are the questions that are running in your mind, so that it can inform better our primer, but also we can ask and use the power of this network so we can have meaningful discussions. And if you're one of this multitask person, go ahead and provide your answers while you're listening to the presentation. Go to www.menti.com. The code is 7883-7832, and I'm going to share very shortly the link in the chat. But now, without further ado, I'm going to pass it to our incredible crew that worked very hard the last months in putting this information into 2 primers and in this presentation as well. Kiana, take it away.
Could you enable me to screen share?
Yes. You can try now.
Perfect.
So in conjunction with the Clean Air Partnership, our group has conducted research on urban forestry and stormwater management plans used by municipalities and organizations in Ontario.
Okay, our research aims to answer the questions. Who are the leading municipalities in integrating climate change into municipal plans? And what differentiates an urban forestry or stormwater plan that incorporates climate change from one that does not? Alyssa, you're muted.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to walk you guys through our research process. In order to address the question, what makes official plans that incorporate climate change different from those that do not, we undertook an analysis of Ontario municipalities' urban forestry and stormwater plans. And that's how we determined the current and leading practices in each respective department. From this analysis, we then identified 7 municipalities and 2 conservation authorities whose current plans contain leading climate change integration practices. And then interviews were conducted with these municipalities to gain an insight into development methods and best practices. From these interviews, we then developed teaching tools, which are the primers, from our desktop research and interview responses.
So both of our teams looked at various Ontario municipalities on this map. Green represents our urban forestry team and the municipalities they looked at, and blue represents stormwater management team. And you can see that there was a lot of overlap between our two teams. The urban forestry team consisted of myself, Alyssa, Casper, and Kiana. And to examine the extent of climate change incorporated in urban forestry management, we first looked at leading practices in Ontario municipalities to help us identify practices, and some of the ones that we will mention are not common practice.
So one of the current practices was natural capital valuation. Natural capital valuation refers to assessing the monetary value of various natural assets, such as the urban forest. This assessment requires research done by the municipality, which requires a lot of time and resources. And because of this, many municipalities don't have information on the value of their urban forests. There are various tools that can be used to help assess the natural capital value. And one such tool is iTree Tools, led by the USDA Forest Service, which contains many resources for assessing the urban forest, including tree canopy assessment. This, as well as others, which will be mentioned in a few slides, are valuable tools which municipalities can use in valuing natural capital. In our research, the urban forest study published in 2023 by the town of Ajax really stood out. This study utilized the iTree tools, which allowed Ajax to derive various monetary values regarding the services provided by natural capital, including the values you can see on the screen. This helped Ajax develop a list of recommendations which can be used in future urban forestry management plans. It's clear from this study that the efforts to value natural capital will prove valuable to municipalities.
Another thing commonly addressed in the municipal plans that we looked at were urban heat islands. To some extent, most municipalities agreed that addressing urban heat islands through urban forestry creates resiliency against more frequent extreme heat events. To aid in creating this resiliency, strategic tree planting locations were identified in conjunction with identifying high-risk areas through a prioritization index. Specifically, the city of Guelph applied an internal tool developed by the Peel region called the Tree Planting Prioritization Index to do so. And in doing so, the plans also acknowledged the importance of canopy cover, another focus of current practices. As such, most plans set targets for urban canopy cover expansion specific to public and private land. Usually they would assess the current coverage in the municipality, set goals for where they would like to be by a specific date, and then create maintenance recommendations to ensure that this goal is reached. The most popular coverage goal was about 40%, which is in alliance with the USDA recommendation based on urban forestry capacity for carbon sequestration. But of all the interviewed municipalities, Ottawa only set a goal of 30% coverage.
All right, so moving on to leading practices, and these are pretty much just exemplary current practices. We've got 3 key points here. The first is evidence-based analysis for realistic but ambitious enough goals for things like canopy covers. While it's good to be ambitious and include ideal targets in plans, it's important to be realistic in regards to budgeting, unfortunately. Collaboration between municipal financial planners and urban forestry planners is going to be essential in setting these realistic goals, which brings us to the integration of trees and asset management. Because there's sometimes this idea that financial and environmental goals have to be at odds, but as previously discussed with the natural capital valuation of urban forests with the iTree tools, this is not necessarily the case. Ecosystem services provided by trees can be worth a lot financially, like we saw with the valuation by Ajax. Recognizing the value of the urban forest as a natural capital asset can help with both their protection, as we tend to want to protect assets, and making more ambitious canopy cover goals financially realistic. Urban forest as a green infrastructure item can be more efficient, affordable, and sustainable than various technological and or reactive rather than proactive solutions to issues such as public health. And finally, we've got canopy construction and maintenance. Setting canopy cover targets usually involves expanding the canopy. However, not all the focus can just go towards expansion. Existing canopy needs to be maintained. It's an issue of both quality and quantity. We can't just have a lot of one kind of tree. Urban forest species assembly will be particularly important in the face of ongoing climate change, as diversity begets resilience, and we want to acknowledge that certain species are they're going to be more resilient even on their own, but that diversity is still important.
Awesome. And then here in our next phase of the primer, we looked at how municipalities were adapting urban forestry plans to climate change. We screened for commonalities across UFMPs and how they integrated climate change into their future plans. So we start off with hazard identification and risk assessment. This is a tool that comes out of the City of Toronto, and it's based on a wider scale, but can be integrated into UFMPs and climate change as well. It looks at frequency, type, and impact of the risk to the region. We also look at short, long, and medium-term horizons for the impact of climate change on the urban forest. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a great resource for developing probability curves under different business as usual and stabilizing scenarios to predict the impact of hazards. We looked at the direct impact, secondary impact, and cascading impacts of hazards identified. And this will be further in depth in primers, which you will have access to following this presentation. Second action is opportunity gap identification. This is where you would understand the current tree selection process and conduct your evaluation of natural capital assets. We then looked at watershed integration as we found a common overlap between stormwater and urban forestry. As extreme weather increases and we have increased flooding effects, we need to look at tree resilience. And then fourth, we looked at strategy development. What is the desired plan? The desired outcome of the plan, so your vision. We analyze the trends identified in our first 3 steps, and then we move on to implementation. So who is going to take action and when? This would be involving communities, which a lot of municipalities already do. It's essential to the development of UFMPs, but now we shift the focus into looking at climate change and which low density areas, neighborhoods can be targeted with specific programs. And then also we have monitor and maintain. How will you know when your desired outcome is achieved? So this is monitoring planting initiatives going forward. And then jumping to our next slide, we have our resource toolbox. So this expands beyond just our leading municipalities that we interviewed. We also looked at tools in the US, as well as tools across the Peel region, the TRCA, and the Durham region had some excellent climate change adaptation tools as well. I'm just going to touch on a couple of these. So an excellent tool we found was the Planting Tree Species and Selection tool developed by City of Richmond Hill. It digs into selection based on soil quality, sunlight requirement, drought resilience, and availability. And the matrix covers over 100 trees. Another tool for natural capital valuation is Stanford's Natural Capital Project, which is it's called INVEST. It's integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs. And it's an open source software tool for exploring how ecosystems changes will likely lead to benefits that flow to people. So this tool is designed to inform decisions about your natural resource management, and it's been used globally to implement ecosystem service supply and value by quantifying, mapping, and valuing their benefits. And then lastly, we also have the UFMP Toolkit for Climate Resilience, which is a USDA tool that is an excellent step-by-step for how you will integrate climate resilience into your UFMPs.
Apologies. The Stormwater team consisted of myself, Kathy, Grace, and Malika, and we specifically looked at the ways that climate change considerations can be implemented into existing stormwater infrastructure. So the current practices that we've currently observed are common across municipalities and conservation authorities we've interviewed, and there are a few examples of emerging plans that municipalities are looking at. Okay, there are two current practices in this slide that we're going to highlight. The first being LID practices. So as you can see on the screen, low impact development is LID. And LID practices collect runoff at the source and try to minimize environmental impacts as much as possible. They utilize an ecosystem approach that tries to preserve natural environments, again, as much as possible. And as you can see on the slide, vegetative filter strips are an example of an LID practice. So these are basically planted in between areas that have a lot of polluted runoff and natural aquatic environments. So that's something that can be implemented. And there are currently financial incentives for LID practices to be implemented in the Niagara region and Toronto. And green and gray infrastructure ties very closely to low impact development practices. So green infrastructure is more natural and integrated into ecosystems. So this includes retention ponds, grass cover, and as I mentioned before, vegetative filter strips. And gray infrastructure is essentially constructed. So this consists of things like pipes, drains, and physical processing facilities. So leading practices that we've observed involve a larger focus on green infrastructure in combination with gray infrastructure. And a municipality that is currently leading in this sense is Richmond Hill. So as you can see on the image to the very right, that's a picture of Rumble Pond in Richmond Hill. And they're currently using strategies such as an oil grit separator, a filtration unit, and intensive vegetation and landscape planning.
The additional topics of current practices that we're looking at are infrastructure design integration, addressing multifaceted climate change impacts, and exploring climate change collaboration opportunities. First of all, stormwater management infrastructure can be designed to mitigate potential climate change impacts by considering material effects of climate change, such as how increased rainfall and heightened flooding risk may affect these systems. As an example, stormwater management system capacities can be modeled using intensity duration frequency, or IDF curves, to assess if these systems can manage predicted water flows. Richmond Hill is currently looking to incorporate updated IDF curves that reflect climate change scenarios to predict potential impacts of these increased climate risks, and these conclusions can be used to design infrastructure accordingly. Second, can consider multifaceted climate change impacts on stormwater management systems in their design. Stormwater management strategies and infrastructure can contribute to or reduce the impact of climate change, while they themselves are also susceptible to climate change influences. While stormwater management infrastructure can improve water quality and rehabilitate green spaces, they can also pose risks of greenhouse gases emissions and habitat damage when they are being constructed. Extreme weather events may also damage such infrastructure. So therefore, adequate climate-conscious stormwater management strategies would consider a wide variety of factors in their design. Finally, we've observed many positives from collaboration across and within municipalities. Many municipality borders are smaller than watersheds, Therefore, it would be beneficial for municipalities residing within the same watershed to expand collaborations and collectively formulate a stormwater management strategy centered on this watershed. Additional opportunities for collaboration lie in sharing information, resources, and connection, cooperating on specific projects, such as collaborating on water sanitary systems between Richmond Hill and Ridge regions when resources and processes intersect, and working with local conservation authorities and indigenous communities to incorporate their extensive knowledge and on-the-ground expertise.
Okay, so after learning about some current practices, let's take a look at leading practices. So the first leading practice we've identified is prioritizing green infrastructure. The Green Development Standard is a framework that CAP has created, since a leading practice is to incorporate green infrastructure into development standards. So municipalities may use this framework to ensure environmental resiliency and social well-being when building infrastructure. So examples of this could include having metrics for energy or water conservation, requirements to maintain a certain % canopy cover, and maintaining access to public parks. And so this can be ensured through implementing these green standards for buildings and developments. And then so other green infrastructure such as bioswales and rain gardens, we notice they're not incredibly widespread. So we also advocate for these bioretention methods as a green infrastructure solution. And then moving on to LID, we saw that prioritizing low impact development is a leading practice. And this means managing stormwater as close to the source as possible to preserve natural features. So best management practices would then include retention ponds, permeable pavement, and green roofs. Moving on to policy. So within creating the primers, we witnessed firsthand how these departmental silos can feel. So this means that leading practices will encourage sharing data and strategies. And a municipality we interviewed mentioned how Saskatoon stormwater ponds served as a prime example of something they wanted to implement in the future. So we'd love to see further collaboration like that between municipalities. And finally, looking at climate modeling. So rather dealing with the aftermath of large climate events, we've seen that collecting data to model future conditions is a leading practice. So with in silico modeling, such as IDF curves, again, that's intensity, duration, and frequency curves. That's an example that assists with future climate projections and future stormwater management practices.
And here we have some examples of stormwater management methods being used across Canada today. TRCA's increasing green infrastructure has included the preservation of mature existing trees for water absorption and filtration. And then in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, they've allowed the use of stormwater retention ponds for recreational purposes, although certain ones are disallowed for environmental conservation. One municipality we interviewed expressed interest in implementing a similar program where they are. Durham Region, in conjunction with TRCA, has used a 100-year projection of future climate trends to predict and adapt to increased precipitation.
We've currently drafted a 4-step plan for adapting stormwater management plans to a changing climate. So first, it's really important to assess environmental impacts before implementing stormwater projects, notably through participating in 3 main things. The first being environmental impact assessments, which the province conducts to outline who's affected by stormwater projects. So this might include marginalized communities who are underrepresented when it comes to climate change policy. Second, as Malika mentioned, climate modeling is really important for the assessment of natural disasters, temperature changes, precipitation levels, and more. This ensures that preventative measures may be implemented efficiently. And lastly, LID estimation tools are really useful for determining the resources and funding required for LID projects, as well as the relevant stakeholders. Second, it's important to develop strategies for stormwater development, notably the potential assessment of stormwater retention targets. We must ask if these need to be changed in consideration of municipalities' unique needs, landscapes, and precipitation levels. Next, implementation requires collaboration between municipalities to increase the capability to carry out stormwater developments and master planning capacities. Since watersheds don't necessarily have boundaries, and for example, a watershed might exist in between two boundaries of municipalities, it's really imperative that municipalities work together on stormwater projects. And lastly, impact assessments would involve expanding workshop capacities to gain feedback on proposed stormwater projects, sort of like what we're doing right now, while involving the community, continuing to engage in environmental impact assessments and assessing the direct impacts of climate change.
Finally, we shall assess limitations of our research and derive recommendations for future work. As students, we have to recognize that we're not fully equipped with specialist and industry knowledge that could better inform and guide our research design. Meanwhile, much of the information that we have obtained is based on a quick scan of the management plans that we've mentioned previously. It's possible that some information was missed, which could restrain the thoroughness of our analysis. Because of this, we've chosen to identify best practices and are not making any direct recommendations. Additionally, our report is based on interviews, which could potentially introduce biases from those that we have interviewed. Finally, our research focused on select Ontario municipalities, which makes our conclusions applicable mainly to this region. It will be difficult to generalize or apply these findings to a different geographic region. We also have some recommendations for future research that might be similar to us. First of all, future research could expand the reach to examine international examples, such as in the United States, to broaden the research scope and allow for more room for comparisons. There's also potential for investigating these overlapping impacts between urban forestry and stormwater management plans, as well as how these strategies can interact with broader municipal plans to examine how we can develop more collaborative strategies. Finally, future researchers could collaborate with more diverse communities and marginalized groups in their consultation or strategy design processes, since the implementation of such municipal plans have the potential to greatly impact these communities, and we want to ensure that the strategies that we are proposing are inclusive and considerate. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and we'd love to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much to the team of from UFT. Thank you guys for this presentation and for generally putting work. So now I kind of want to open it for any questions and discussion. As Kadi mentioned at the end, our scope was kind of narrow, so we want to hear from you if we missed work in your integration of climate change into these plans. Please feel free to jump in and provide a bit more information. We want to know from you what work is happening in your jurisdiction. I'm very happy to see Sharon sharing the TRCA nature-based climate solutions sitting tool that was launched yesterday. So something that kind of like comes as a next step on this is that we will have a discussion with municipal folks on that topic, and this is gonna help us to define the primer that I was talking about, where we want to incorporate more information that it's not just for urban forestry and stormwater, but add into it. And all of these links that are shared here will be also incorporated. Yeah, feel free at this point to jump into Menti. I'm going to share the link right now, or just verbally kind of like let us know, is this applicable, what we heard? Oh, okay. No, I don't think we covered carbon offsets, Hannah, but a very good question that came, let me see, where was that? And we're interested to hear if someone on the call has an answer on that. Are there any examples folks could provide for working with developers to add trees to subdivisions and residential developments that doesn't get cut through the new build homes? I would like to see this because I'm witnessing in my neighborhood how this is happening. Mark, you will be inactive in the chat, saying to connect with Khaled on that topic.
I could mention something. It's Mark here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great presentation. Well done. This doesn't necessarily sort of relate to sort of current practice, but something that, you know, we might want to consider now and then into the future is what to do about all the wood waste. So with forest fires, increased windstorms, downing trees, there's going to continue to be a lot of biomass basically that is going to need to be processed, and I don't think we're, you know, prepared enough to manage this, and there's also an opportunity to, you know, explore it for use in turning into some sort of a biofuel through the, you know, novel technologies. So I just want to flag that as another, I guess, climate related opportunity for us to bring in that sort of circular economy piece to the conversation too.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. No, that's great. I'm gonna add this to the conversations and the topics for our kind of like internal CAC meeting. Thanks for jumping on this. Any other someone wants to like jump in and provide either comments, questions that we should be reviewing in the next meeting, or where you are right now and integrating. Thank you so much. I'm guessing, Mark, that was you. I see that in Menti you provided information on what's happening in that the urban forest management plan embeds PO's best practices, integrating climate change management practice. Thanks. Hamilton responded, Richmond Hill responded. I also see as a next step, and kind of like we'll hear shortly from Jade on their research, and once the research is finalized, I think we're gonna have another conversation on the rate scan, but also moving forward, and correct me, like I was thinking when we were doing the interview with Richmond Hill that they are doing this ID curve that it's very kind of like proactive into like a leading practice of be ready for climate change and using it as a resilience piece. Is that something that will be interesting to the others as well, to hear more about the technical part and aspect of how to do the research, the modeling of this curve?
Yep, Curtis Elton here from City of Toronto. I think that would be helpful information for sure.
Okay.
I know the federal government has developed something that we're looking at sort of on a pilot basis at the city. But certainly learning from what other municipalities are doing would always be helpful on that front.
Nice. Okay. It's good to know. Thanks, Curtis, for joining. Question, and I'm guessing this question is for folks on the call as well. And Jade, feel free to jump in here. And the students as well, did your urban forestry study factor in the ash die-off strategy for canopy recover or assisted migration, bringing up Carolinian species? That's very specific.
Hi, Jesse.
Hi.
I can answer.
Thanks.
Hi, folks. I just for the call, I am no longer with the town of Ajax. I left back in 2019, but it was one of the last pieces of work I finished off before that, before I moved to the town of Whitby. And I loved working on that project. We partnered with Dillon Consulting at the time. And I can confirm that the Natural Capital Climate Vulnerability Assessment did include impacts associated with invasive species, and not only ash, but even back in 2019, we included some early anticipations of the effects of oak wilt as well on our urban canopy. And then in terms of assisted migration, Yes, we did, in fact, factor in the introduction of 2 southern zones of planting species into the modeling of growing our urban canopy. So that is typically the approach that's taken under these assessments now.
Thanks, Jade, for jumping on this. Since you're already talking, would you like to provide us a little bit of the update on the OFC research?
For sure. I do have a little deck here, and I promise to be quick. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes.
Alrighty. Just make sure it's the right one. All right, yes, hi everybody, Jade Schofield here. Today I am speaking with you from the Ontario Urban Forest Council, which I'm currently serving as president. It's a non-profit volunteer-based organization. We've actually been around for 60 years, not me personally, not quite at 60 years. But we've been delivering a number of solutions to municipalities, academia, conservation authorities, research entities, and practitioners to help advance and protect the urban forestry. And of course, climate change is a major lens in the work that we do. We'll have to do a little bit of a plug. We are completely volunteer-based, and our functionality relies 100% on the support of our members and sponsors. So if you are a municipality that is not yet an active member in the OUFC, would love to see you sign up. You do get access to a lot of free in-person and educational webinars. We share resources. We are there to support. You know, we can provide advice on tree issues. We can come to council and advocate for policies and best practices. There's a whole suite of things, and we also deliver a number of programs as well, including Heritage Tree Program and our mentorship program. So Desi was kind enough to invite me to speak today on a research project that we conducted last year in partnership with Royal Roads University to understand the synergies between climate change plans and urban forest management plans in Ontario at the municipal level. And what we were trying to understand, and this kind of hails a little bit from me personally, having worked on both UFMPs and climate change plans, is there's a lot of crossover, but there is also some differences. And I think I saw this from Sarah at the City of London. You know, urban forest management plans really peaked in uptake and development around like the 2010, 2015 years. There was this thing called emerald ash borer that came in that decimated a lot of our ash trees. That sparked a lot of interest from political representatives to fund the development of urban forest plans. Some municipalities have done a fabulous job of maintaining those plans and keeping them up to date. Other municipalities, though, have also transferred to climate change plans that have embedded urban forestry into their management strategies. So there is a synergy, and we wanted to highlight where those synergies are and where there is opportunities to share resources, share opportunities, and also share successes. So many of the folks on the call may have participated in a fairly comprehensive survey last year. And we also conducted a sampling of interviews with a number of folks as well that work predominantly in the forestry sector, but we also touched base with some climate change folks too. And we wanted to understand who had private tree bylaws in place that are currently being implemented, who had urban forest management plans, and then who had climate action plans. And what's really interesting is that climate action plans, although they tend to be slightly newer, more municipalities have had the uptake of these plans to date. And then we dug a little bit deeper into all of these plans, and you can imagine it's quite an undertaking at a provincial-wide scale, but we wanted to understand where within the themes there were synergies. So we saw a lot as it relates to the synergies between urban forestry and climate around species diversification, management of invasive species, extreme weather mitigation. Some of those things, there were almost direct synergies in terms of actions identified. So again, learning from a municipal perspective that there is a fairly large business case for why these actions may need to be prioritized. Again, here's a bit of the risk the synergies. So risk assessment is a really big one. And it comes really from the resiliency plan or the adaptation planning side, really focusing on future climate conditions, whereas an urban forest management plan quite often embeds a risk assessment on the trees under current conditions. So there really is actually an opportunity to bring those two solutions together, especially knowing that tree assets, if managed and maintained well, should actually still be around well into those future climate projections. Again, providing we put the right right maintenance and infrastructure supports for them to grow and reach the largest potential. There's a lot of synergies around climate equity, and I do want to highlight that. It's a fairly new topic on the climate lens, but also under the biodiversity lens is understanding the distribution of urban forest canopy and how it plays a role in vulnerable neighborhoods, exposure to extreme weather events, but also just, healthy, complete communities. And so there is a lot of synergies now in terms of looking at the social demographic information as it relates to urban canopy cover and as it relates to climate risk exposure as well. When it comes to some of the differences, I do want to highlight urban forest actions, really require regular inventories. Urban forests is not just about the long-term planning, but it's also about the day-to-day operational management of the urban forest canopy. So like your arborists and your public works staff all the way up to planning and corporate strategy. So that regular inventory and maintenance quite often now is through the asset management process, through GIS, is quite critical. Setting canopy cover targets. We do see a bit of a trend in urban forest management plans, a 30% canopy cover target, whereas climate change plans push a bit more aggressively to a 40% canopy target where they exist. Pest management is really about current pests on the landscape. It doesn't necessarily look at future pests, so it's a bit more reactive, but also a lot more integrated. You're getting into specific mitigation methods, for example, with emerald ash borer, the application of tree is in and how you actually apply that on the landscape. Whereas in urban forest management plans, it's more about, species diversification and finding ways to minimize the impact of pests. Urban forest management plans get really into the nitty-gritty of enhanced maintenance and pruning. So, pruning schedules, soil conditions, and things like that, whereas climate action plans tend to be a little bit more high level. Species diversification, and this is really interesting because there's synergies and there's also differences here on species. So we had a question earlier around bringing in Carolinian species that are more resilient to a changing climate for our conditions. And with urban forestry, that really is a push towards current native species. Under climate change plan, you see a lot more drought tolerant and Carolinian or adaptive species being recommended. So I think there's some conversations there in terms of how to align those two best practices under both an urban forest opportunity and a climate change opportunity. Tree preservation bylaw and development standards comes up in both, very strong. However, the implementation of private tree bylaws in particular seems to be a really big barrier still for a lot of municipalities. The west side of the GTA tends to be quite strong. Most municipalities do have a private tree bylaw. The east side of the GTA, though, still is really struggling in this area, and this might be an opportunity for shared synergies and experiences, but also an understanding of the administration and cost impacts of this effort. Targeted planting in urban forests really focuses primarily on municipally owned land and conditions that suit. Climate change plans tend to also look at private lands as well. And I think that might be a timing piece. We are running out of planting opportunities on municipal lands. So the larger opportunities are starting to sit on privately owned lands for meeting those canopy targets. Heritage trees, it really ties back to the tree preservation bylaws and how to make sure that Trees are protected either through development, either through changes to private land occupation and management. Trees can only reap the benefits that we are calculating them to reap if we allow them to grow to their potential. So heritage trees are a big focus under both UFMPs and climate plans. And then dedicated resources. It's hard to manage an urban forest canopy, and residents are very passionate about trees, either one way or the other. You know, and I would question any municipality to dig into their customer service calls and just see the sheer amount that urban forest management staff have to deal with on a daily basis, but even more so looking at the responses that they have to work on after an extreme weather event, a windstorm or an ice storm, as well as increased pests. So the need for more dedicated resources to meet the objectives in the UFMP is getting more critical. And then quickly on the climate actions, you know, I mentioned, you know, increased pruning and maintenance, but really at a high level is the strategy approach. Invasive species management looks at a future lens. So what could be coming into our community and as it relates to climate projections, warmer climates, and therefore more favorable pest conditions. Canopy cover targets are definitely more aggressive in climate plans. 40% is typically what we see, and this aligns with United Nations science around what makes a sustainable urban canopy. Starting to see more focus on species migration as well as increased native species. Land conservation and connected natural heritage systems are becoming quite prominent in climate change plans. And this relates to both urban forestry, but also ties into the stormwater and flood risk management. Connected landscapes really can help reduce some of the other exposures to climate risks as well. And then again, as I mentioned, tree equity, and this is really coming from the lens of heat exposure. So a lot of synergies, slight differences, but at the end of the day, whether you are approaching this through the lens of an urban forest management plan or a climate change plan, there are keys to success in both solutions. And first and foremost is making sure you engage both your forestry and climate change staff early in the UFMP or climate change planning stages. There's a lot of synergies. Make sure you get them into your RFPs when you're delivering those procurement packages, so that you end up working with a consultant that understands both urban forestry and climate change. Data readiness, making sure you have an urban forest inventory that's up to date so that you can undergo a climate risk assessment. I think I don't need to preach to this crowd about the importance of equity in all of the work that we do at the municipal level, but you know, whether you're coming at this from an urban forest management lens or climate change, you know, considering social vulnerability, is there equal tree canopy across your community? What are the exposure rates to heat? Is there access to green space for all members of your community? Embedding future climate conditions, I think that's a no-brainer. Planning for today is not going to protect our urban canopy tomorrow. We really need to be looking future in all of the work we're doing, again, from both lenses. We touched on today on the great presentation earlier around the different approaches and tools available to understand exposure, climate vulnerability, and risk. You can get super detailed like we did at the town of Ajax, where we got species and individual tree location specific, or you can do a very high level assessment depending on the budget and time. But really embedding that into your approach will help you understand where those priority areas are, because we know that resources are limited and time is limited. So you really want to be tackling those actions where those actions are needed the most within your community. 71% of the municipalities we spoke to have already engaged a public-private partnership in some way to deliver planting programs or adopted tree programs in some way, shape or form. So I will give a big shout out to LEAF and Forest Ontario with Take Root Guelph as great examples. You know, they really can act as a huge ambassador for getting trees in the ground on private property while de-risking the municipality's exposure to working on private property, because there is some legal challenges there. So there's lots of opportunities out there for that. And then the business case, trees are really a gateway action to climate change. It is one of the least political topics when it comes to moving on climate change. But the way that you can really push the needle on going from planning to action is making sure you incorporate the true business case of urban forest efforts. The cheapest part of managing and maintaining urban tree canopy is planting the tree. There is a lot of costs and long-term requirements for maintaining an urban forest an urban forest canopy, and maintaining those trees so that they remain healthy and can grow to their full potential. But also, the larger those tree gets, the bigger the service benefits that they provide. I like to end on this, in that trees are one of the only assets in a community that actually increase in value over time. So incorporating that into the business case can really help to drive nature-based solutions. And that's it from me. If you're interested in learning more about OUFC and all that we do, or if you need support, feel free to reach out to us by the top email. If you're interested in some of the climate vulnerability work, or just have questions about some of the previous work I've done on the more technical side, feel free to reach out to me via Delphi. Thanks, Desi.
Thanks so much, Jade, for jumping in and providing this overview. And this was just a presentation of the research, but there's going to be a kind of like a paper report on that. And once it is completed and ready, we'll be sharing it to all of you as well. Open for any questions and comments. Thanks everyone for who is putting your responses in Menti. Feel free, it's a survey, so feel free to kind of like go to the next questions in the survey and complete it there. I'm gonna stop for a second to see what comments came in the chat. Right. Oh, thank you very much for the interactive chatting today and using the chat. So kind of like, Jade, how often this inventory, you started with like a big, like the kind of like the key to success is like starting with the inventory and knowing your tree canopy, like how often this needs to happen? What's the current practice now and where it should be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say in Ontario, we're really moving towards almost a live inventory. A lot of municipalities have embedded like a work order system that is tied to individual assets. So tree inventories can, especially those on municipal property, can almost be kept live. But in terms of like monitoring the growth in the overall canopy at like a more larger scale, using something like LiDAR, 4 to 8 years is a good approach to use, typically in line with the update timelines of either your climate plan or your urban forest management plan.
Right. And this is it like currently most of the GTHA municipalities are doing some kind of inventory. Am I correct in this?
I would say most of the larger municipalities are there. I know it's a bit more challenging for the smaller municipalities who don't have the resources. Like I said, from an asset management legislation perspective, many have included trees in their inventory, but it may be more static than it is that live approach. So I would say most municipalities have some kind of inventory. How live and how detailed they are is really going to depend on how in-depth they went or specialized they went.
Right. Yeah. And is there any support for those municipalities and like some resources or some organization or something that can like help them in this?
I would say feel free to reach out to the Ontario Urban Forest Council if you need some guidance on like method and approach. If you are thinking about going this way, it is getting cheaper to do this work, but one of the things that we could help you do is also connect you with other smaller municipalities, so you could potentially do a group purchase of an inventory, like especially if you're going like the LiDAR route, so that you're really reaping the benefits of that joint partnership.
Right. Thanks a lot. So I kind of like want to bring back, because we have also folks that are specifically here for this for the last like 4 minutes, folks that are here specifically for the stormwater plan. So kind of like a brief, what we've heard from the research that the students did is like the best, like the main practices of difference between the climate change integration now in current stormwater plans is the use of LID, green infrastructure, and IDF curves. Are we missing something? And is this applicable, like these three, are they applicable in your municipalities? Curtis, should I call you back on the call?
Sorry, your question was, are those three things applicable to stormwater management plans?
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think, you know, your research picked up a trend towards more green infrastructure LID. That's certainly a focus in Toronto as well. It is a challenge given all of the sort of spatial constraints within Toronto and the amount of development that's going on there. So I think, you know, compared to maybe some other municipalities, we might have somewhat different circumstances, but certainly that's a focus in Toronto as well.
Right. And is there anything that we are missing, like kind of like a practice or other type of integration that Toronto is doing that we didn't talk about in like climate change integration into stormwater plans or practices?
No, I don't think so. I mean, nothing comes to mind. I mean, we certainly have despite the, you know, you mentioned green infrastructure as sort of a leading practice within your research. We have a lot of built infrastructure going on within Toronto to meet some of our objectives that we don't, like, based on what my understanding, we couldn't really achieve those objectives with just green infrastructure. So like the Don River and Central Waterfront project, for example, is a huge infrastructure project and investment. Probably wouldn't be able to meet the project's objectives using green infrastructure. So there's, yeah, that striking that balance and moving more towards the green infrastructure side is going to be, it's a longer term challenge. And again, given the circumstances within Toronto, I think sometimes we just run out of space as far as where we're going to actually build that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. No, thanks so much for confirming, which means that the kind of like the top three things that differentiate the climate change integration into stormwater plans and in stormwater plans without, or practices without this, it's the LID, the green infrastructure, the IDF curves. So thank you, students, for putting this together. So kind of like next step will be, we're going to meet on a separate webinar with the stormwater folks, and I'm going to invite Richmond Hill to talk about their IDF curve. And then we're going to gather more information and more questions for you on that topic, and more kind of like what is applicable and what's not in your municipality. Then on a separate meeting, we are going to try to combine the kind of like the broader climate change stuff, but also urban forestry and stormwater plans, so we can dig in a little bit, and probably even more, probably it's going to be like a larger group of like what other plans are picking up this climate integration. I saw some comments here for like other plans, and also probably climate staff need to reach out to like other departments to figure out what is happening, because we want to have a sense and kind of like a scan of what other municipal plans are incorporating the climate change. And also I'll be informing you more for like our where we put this information in one primer, and how it's going to look like as we go. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the team from UFT on your work. Thanks, Jade, for your presentation. Thanks for everyone that provided comments and participated in the conversations. And stay tuned for more. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.